Hi there, BookTube. It's Roz with part 2 of my books of the year. And this time I'm talking about the novels, all the novels. Now, I read 83 novels this year, so I'm only going to talk about those that I rated as 5 stars. And as I said in part 1, rating is in some ways it's a mug's game, but it does concentrate the mind when you have to think, where does this stand for me in my year? And I'm excluding any novels that were rereads because, what's the point of me telling you on an annual basis that, Persuasion is one of the best books ever? So I won't do that. But I'm splitting this into 3 groups. And one group is kind of classic or backlist novels written in English. One is novels in translation. And then I'm going to wind up with contemporary novels, a sort of a top 10 of things that are from the last few years. So let's go with the old stuff. So I've had 5-star novels this year that were new to me, and I'm going to rate them from 5 to 1 bravely. Now, if I tell you that number 5 was Daniel Deronda by George Eliot, you will know that this is a good 5 books, because this is a very fine book, and George Eliot is one of my top 3 favourite writers. And this is a chunky one, lots to love in it. It's not quite up with Middlemarch for me, but it's so rich, and Eliot can do no wrong as far as I'm concerned. So that's number 5. Number 4 was Dr. Thorne by Anthony Trollope. This is the 3rd of his Bastos Chronicles. Now, I think what I realised reading Dr. Thorne is that Trollope can just write the perfect big Victorian novel. He can just put in all the elements that make it right. You get the love story, and you get the humour, and you get the social commentary, and you get the plot with some dramatic things happening and a bit of suspense, and and he really speaks to you as the reader. So that's number 4. Oh, number 3, it's Eliot again. I read Adam Bede, which was her first full-length novel, and it was so fresh and so charming and so delightful that I actually liked it better than Daniel Deronda, although in some many ways Daniel Deronda is more sort of serious and weighty, but I loved Adam Bede. Number 2 is a book by one of my other top 3 favourite authors. It's The Waves by Virginia Woolf. And this is the most, could have been one of the most challenging reads of the whole year for me. Virginia Woolf is a modernist novelist. You know that she's, stream of consciousness is her, almost her defining sort of feature as a novelist. The Waves is the book where she takes that to the extreme. It is wonderful, but if you were saying, if I were making a Virginia Woolf where not to start video, this would be the one that I'd say don't start here. Glorious though. So if Eliot and Woolf are not number 1, what was? My number 1 classic or backlist sort of novel of the year was Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell. Why? A much less challenging read, a much less complex read than Deronda. Yeah, less challenging, but just the most joyous reading experience of my year, I think. It's laugh out loud funny some of the time, but it's also clever and thoughtful and sensitive and just perceptive about human nature. So that's the oldies out of the way. What about translated novels? Well, I read 33 different translated books this year, but only 15 of those were novels. And of those, 6 were 5-star reads. So, you know, that's a pretty high hit rate, isn't it? Interestingly, all of those are older books. So they range from the 1880s to the 1970s. I did read some really good contemporary translated fiction, like Nervous Systems by Merouan comes to mind, or Eliot Crest, Castilla. I mean, you know, quite a few, but they were all not quite 5 stars. Who knows why? Let's hope in 2022 I have some 5-star reads amongst the contemporary translated fiction that I read. But let's whisk through these. So what was number 6? Number 6 was Chandelier by Clarice Lispector. Now, I'm a bit obsessed with this Brazilian 20th century author. But it's at number 5 because it's not my favourite of her novels that I've read so far. You know, it's not on a par with, say, Agua Viva, which I reread this year. It's a little harder to love, although intellectually extremely interesting. And she just sometimes, she's one of those authors that sometimes she writes a sentence and you think, oh my God, how does she do that? You know, brain goes. What was it, number 5? Number 5, a more straightforward but very rewarding read. I read The Cross, which is this is a trilogy by Sigrid Undset. The trilogy as a whole is called Kristin, Lavransdatter, but it is 3 separate books. And The Cross is the 3rd book in the trilogy. It was published in 1922. She's a Norwegian author. She actually won the Nobel Prize for Fiction. Perhaps they're a bit biased to Norway, but really, really fine writer. It's historical fiction, and she does that thing, that magic thing of a historical fiction writer, of just really getting into the mindset of the time that she's writing about. So 14th century Norway, you're taken right there in every detail, but it's also just a wonderful portrait of the life of Kristin, this fascinating, passionate, unusual woman that she's created. Brilliant stuff. Highly recommended, as I do all these books. But it would appeal to anyone, I think. You know, unlike something like the Clarice Lispector. Now, number 4 is another book that I would not just recommend to anyone. Think hard. Think hard before you take on this book, okay? But if you do, you'll get a lot out of it. It's Either Supreme by Augusto Bastos, and this is a book from Paraguay. It's kind of the 20th century classic of Paraguayan literature, I guess. It's kind of a memoir, fictionalized memoir of the 19th century Paraguayan dictator. And it's a book that is infuriating and fascinating in equal measure. It's quite experimental in form, but you get, it's one of those books where you get back what you put into it in reading it, I would say. I had a buddy read. It was a buddy read, and that really helped me get through that. I read it with Hester, and yeah, I do wonder. He's sometimes described as Paraguay's James Joyce. That probably sums it up for you, doesn't it? Well, what was it, number 3? Number 3 was another South American book, The Posthumous Memoirs of Cubas, which is an 1881 experimental novel by the Brazilian author Joaquim Maria Machado de Assis, and it's another posthumous memoir, strangely enough, as the title says. I mean, because is he dead or not when he's the main character in this? Well, I'll leave you to discover that when you read it, or see what you think. But the Cubas is a kind of ne'er-do-well Brazilian nobleman. Is the main character, and he's definitely dead, and he is speaking. He's speaking to us from beyond the grave, telling us the story of his life in a sort of picaresque fashion that is actually quite satirical, and there's a political message in the book, but it's funny, and it's the supposed character of Cubas has such a strong voice, a voice that literally speaks, that jumps out of telling his story to speak directly to the reader in those sort of asides that are, yeah, such fun. That was number 3. What was number 2? Number 2 is a very special book. Trees on a Slope by Hwang. And this is a Korean novel written in, now, let me just check, 1960. Came out in 1960. So, and it's about the end of and aftermath of the Korean Civil War. Very bitter conflict that left the country physically sort of devastated, but also left a lot of people psychologically damaged. And that's what this book is about. It's quite a bleak book, but very, very beautifully written. I'm so glad I read that one. So what was number 1? Number 1, I wish I had a copy to pick up and show you. And I read it on Kindle and I love it so much, I'm going to go and buy a paper copy because I want to keep it. It's a book called Palace Walk by Naguib Mahfouz. Egyptian author. He came out in 1956. It's the first part of a trilogy, his Cairo trilogy. He ultimately won a Nobel Prize for Literature a bit later on in his life, but the Cairo trilogy was probably a key element in why he is the only Egyptian ever to have won a Nobel Prize for Literature, and indeed the only writer in Arabic, which is slightly shocking, isn't it? I've just made a discussion video with Tom of LA Books about this book, but I will just say it's knockout brilliant to me. It's a realist book, a family saga, and yet so clever and nuanced and subtle and thoughtful and humane and atmospheric, and if you're at all tempted to read it, go and watch my conversation with Tom and you will hear more. So that was my number 1 of translated fiction. So, contemporary novels. Now, I had 10 5-star novels, which was handy because it means I can do a top 10, doesn't it? I will rate them from 10 to 1 for you. So, let's, and one comment I would make, that, you know, when you look back and when I look at these 10 books, I've realised they're all books that are structurally interesting novels, you know, complex, non-linear, you know, they really, I think they do kind of, the fact that they are my top 10 sort of illustrates to me the kind of what my taste is, I suppose, in novels. And if you like my sort of book, you'll know that these are good recommendations for you. Okay. Number 10 is a book that got promoted from 4 stars to 5. And I'll explain why. So the book is Detransition Baby by Tori Peters, and it's not a perfect book, which is why I only gave it 4 stars in a sort of ruthless fashion when I just finished it. But boy, has this book stayed with me since I read it. I kind of replay scenes from it in my mind, and it's actually it's a novel that's expanded my mental world, you know, my understanding, because it's a book about a trans couple, and then one detransitions and gets a new partner pregnant, and then they're kind of trying to work out if between the 3 of them they can be a family for this potential child. Yeah, I'm going to stop there, but that's enough to say. Not a perfect book, but it will it took me into thoughts and experiences that are were enriching for me. Yeah. Number 9 is a Paragon. Transition Baby was a 2021 book. A Paragon was a 2020 book. These are all books from the last few years, okay? And A Paragon is by Colin McCann. And it's a book that is on the fiction non-fiction crossover point. It's a book about the sort of Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It's a book that I was quite conflicted about, because I loved the structure of this book. I loved the voice. I'm really interested in the ideas in the book. It's politically interesting, it's emotionally interesting, it was intellectually interesting. But I also was aware that McCann has been accused of sexual assault, and it's not proven. But it coloured my experience of the book, I suppose, because it's a book about being a decent human being and human relationship, how we should treat each other as human beings. So there was something kind of weird about knowing that there's a question mark over that with him. That's why it's there at number 9. Number 8, much more straightforwardly enjoyable book for me, Alice Smith's Summer. So that's the 4th part of her seasonal quartet. What a tour de force those 4 books have been. I think they've probably all been 5 stars for me. No, there might have, 1 or 2 of them might have been 4. But what she's done is she's written something that is so contemporary and bang up to the minute as she produced each book. It was, like written up into the year that in which it was published. So this came out in 2020, and she's got the hints of the beginning of the pandemic at the beginning of the book. It's I love her style of writing, and in this 4th book she kind of brings together a number of the themes of the quartet and some of the characters, and so it was a really satisfying end, I suppose. Number seven, heading upwards, was another 2020 book, Actress by Anne Enright. Now, Enright is a brilliant Irish novelist, and I've said I wouldn't include any rereads in my sort of listings, but actually this was technically sort of a reread, because I listened to it first as an audiobook and then I reread it on paper, or in fact on Kindle, and it worked so much better for me read like that that's why it's here, because it's a book where it's someone writing about their mother. The actress is the narrator's mother, and the narrator's voice in the book kind of moves, and sometimes it's like she's talking back to her now dead mother. Sometimes it's like she's talking to her husband of many years. Sometimes she seems to be talking to us, the reader, and sometimes it's like she's almost like talking to herself, preparing to write a memoir of her mother. That didn't work so well as the audiobook, but worked wonderfully when I read the written book. So a superb book there at number 7. Number 6 is a book that it's only a 2020 book, but I still felt like I came to it late. And that was Shuggie Bain by Douglas Stewart, because so many people have been raving about this book for at least a year by the time I actually got to read it. Everyone was right in saying it's a brilliant book. Sometimes you come to a book like that and you think, what were they going on about? That's not that hot. But no, it really is. It's about growing up poor and gay and clever in a sort of working class community in Glasgow with an alcoholic mother. And in fact, Shuggie's mother, his wonderful, beautiful, flawed but mercurial mother, is the heart of the book, and it's a beauty. And it although it's a bleak topic, it's a book of loveliness, and humour and richness. My number 5 book is I kind of really debated which way around to put these two, but it's The Prettiest Star by Carter Sickles, also from 2020. I think that this was the most moving novel that I read this year. The one that got to me in the most emotional way. Now, that isn't always something that it's just something I like in a book. Like a book that if I feel I've been sort of manipulated to having strong emotional reaction to a book, sometimes I'll almost downgrade it in my opinion. But this book is absolutely not. It's a book about the early period of the AIDS epidemic, when getting AIDS was basically a death sentence. And it's a book, but more than that, it's a book about family relationships and how a family copes when the bomb is dropped into that family of the son who had sort of run away to New York to live his best life as a gay person, and then came home because he was dying to small town America that would not give him any kind of welcome, and how his family coped with that. Such a good book, very moving, but such a good book. Number four was a book that I again was highly recommended, but I came to a little earlier than. No, the other way around. I felt I came too late. It was The Yield, which came out in 2019 by Tara June Winch, but it didn't become available over here till 2020 at the earliest, I think. She's an Indigenous Australian author, and that is what's at the heart of this book. It's a book about how it's a book about community, and about how language and stories are central to sustaining the sort of identity of an Aboriginal community. She does wonderful things with words and characters. It's a very strongly plotted book as well. So it's not it's a book with a message, but it's not a messagey book. Very fine writing. Number three is a 2021 book, and it's A Passage North by Anuk Ariprakasam, and he's a Sri Lankan author. It's a slow, reflective, meditative, digressive novel, very much like in the head of a very introspective young man. It's about the aftermath of the Sri Lankan Civil War and the sort of genocide of the Tamil population of the one part of the island at the end of that war. It's not going to be everyone's cup of tea as a book. When I say it's slow, there are some scenes that seem to almost play out in real time, or even slower than real time. But it's a book that it's all consuming as you read it, and so beautifully written, and just stays, I thought, on the right side of being over intense and over stylized. Yeah. Number two is I've seen as a couple, I think, of people's number one books, and I can understand why, but it's number two for me, and I'll explain why when I get to my number one. Nupiming by Leanne Betta-Samasaki Simpson. What a unique novel this is. It's she's a Anishinaabe writer, and she is writing from that sort of Anishinaabe tradition rather than from a Western canon novel sort of tradition. but she also brings to it her sensibilities as a poet and a lyricist. So it's a book that's on this one's on the sort of the overlap point between, I guess, between prose and poetry as a novel. It has a cast of characters, both human and sort of archetypes, almost sort of mythological archetypes, and birds, geese, animals, raccoons, yeah. It's one of those books that's almost impossible to explain, and that you actually just have to experience. And if you enter into it with an open mind and an open heart, it will be one of the most rewarding of reads. So what's my number one? Well, firstly, I'm so sad I don't have a paper copy of this, and that's because the paper copy is with Tilly, my daughter. And it's actually the oldest of these contemporary novels, so it actually came out in 2013, so recent but not brand new. Okay, but it's called An Unnecessary Woman, and it's by the Lebanese author Rabbi Alameddine, and it is a book that is my number one, because I just do not understand why this is not better known and more celebrated as a stunning novel and a book lover's novel. A book for book lovers. It's set in Beirut. It's about the city of Beirut. It's sort of about the civil, decades of different bits of civil war and conflict in Beirut, but it's also about the daily life of just living there and the life of the city. It's a book about aging as a woman, topic close to my heart. There's not so many books out there that are about older women and their experience, but above all, it's a book about books, about why we read and why books matter and why they give another sort of, that you can lead one life, your real life, and a second life through the books you read. And that is absolutely what the woman at the centre of this book does. So that, and the other reason that it's my number one, I suppose, is that I absolutely lived in that novel. When I now recall scenes from it, it's more like recalling something from my own memory than thinking back to being in a book. That's a strange way to explain it, but I hope that means something to you. So that was my top novels of the year, and I wholeheartedly recommend them to you as readers.